Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, the face of my guest today, French journalist Edith Bouvier, was seen across the world last month when she appealed on YouTube for help after being injured in a rocket attack on the besieged Syrian city of Homs. Now, two other reporters, the Sunday Times correspondent Mary Colvin and the photographer Remy Ochlik, were both killed in that attack that wounded Bouvier. For 9 days after the attack, she essentially was lying immobilized in a makeshift hospital, tended to by doctors who were loyal to rebels with the Free Syrian Army. Now, those rebels, at great risk to their own lives, eventually helped to get Bouvier out of the country to safety on the Lebanese border. She's here today to talk not just about herself and her own experiences, but really what she experienced as a reporter trying to cover a very complicated conflict. Thank you for being here today. I would like to ask you, first of all, how you're doing, because the last time when we saw you in that video, you were propped up on a couch, you had a blanket over you, and you badly needed help, and there was even talk of having to amputate your leg. You seem like you're making a recovery.
I was very lucky in this tragedy. I have had no complications following the fractures of my leg. So I was lucky after arriving in France that I was very well taken care of. People made sure that there would be no inflammation, that there would be no concern, and I recovered very well. William and I came back to France on the 2nd of March. I had surgery 6 days later, and I left the hospital only 2 days ago. So I'm learning to walk with crutches today, and it's going to take another 3 months in a wheelchair and crutches.
Your two colleagues there, as I mentioned, Mary Colvin, Remy Ochlik, they were much less fortunate. They lost their lives in this blast. We've heard a little bit about it in media reports. How would you describe actually the moment of the blast itself, of the attack? What happened?
It's difficult to describe such a moment because it was so sudden. The attack happened, it began around 8 o'clock in the morning, and the bomb which killed Ari and Rémi exploded on the house around 8:40 a.m. I know approximately the time because when we were asked to leave the house, when the Syrians told us to leave the house, I turned off my phone. I turned off the alarm on my phone, and it was 8:40 then. And that is when the blast happened. When the Syrians were asking us to go back inside, and Rémi and Mary were at the door of the house, and they were blasted 2 meters away from the front door, and they had no way of escaping.
You and your colleague were left injured, and you were tended to, as we said, by these rebel fighters, by doctors, medical staff loyal to the Free Syrian Army. You were very much under their care. How would you describe how they sort of tended to you during that period?
Well, William Daniels was incredibly lucky in this adventure. He was not wounded at all. But Paul Conroy from the Sunday Times was also wounded in the leg, and people realized in London later that a piece of shrapnel had damaged his back, and I was very well cared for by the doctors in Homs. Evidence of that is, as I was explaining earlier, there were no complications, no infection. I was given enough blood. The femur, the part of the bone that was damaged, that was broken, is a region which bleeds a lot. I received enough blood, and people made sure that I was receiving enough antibiotics to avoid any form of infection. People made sure that my leg was in traction constantly so that the bones would not damage the arteries.
So you were fortunate that even under very difficult circumstances, you had people caring for you. You went there as a journalist, like I said, to cover an extremely difficult story. Was it difficult for you all of a sudden to, this might seem like an insensitive question, but to remain objective about the story and not to make it become a story about yourself after you were injured? Must have felt very awkward for you.
I remain a journalist. I'm not a militant. I was just wounded by a mortar shell by the Syrian army. And being protected by the Free Syrian Army, my position is slightly awkward. That's true. But the situation of all the journalists who report on the situation in Syria leads to the fact that they are necessarily hidden from the regime and protected by the rebels.
There is no choice, really.
Or you can ask for a regular visa from Damascus, but that requires that you be followed by the secret services of Syria. It requires a different treatment. And I don't think that you can cover Syria in a really objective way. I would have been happy to get information from the authorities in Damascus regarding the reasons for the shelling of the press center, which hosted foreign journalists, but it's difficult.
Mais c'est difficile, as you said. It's very difficult. And I'm just wondering here, the rebel soldiers who were protecting you, a lot of people have suggested, there's been speculation. Did they put you under pressure to film this video? How did the actual decision say, I should make this appeal on YouTube, this personal appeal for help? How did that decision come about? Did you feel like you were being used as part of rebel propaganda ever?
The first video that was filmed in the hospital was done without my knowing. That is true. I was still under the shock of the emotion of the death of Rémi Oschlik and Marie Colvin, the shock and the trauma of the explosion that had wounded my leg, a bit of apprehension as to what was going to become of us. And that video I did not really claim responsibility for, but I think it is the duty of the Syrians to film every moment of life so that they can testify. For over a year, since the 15th of March 2011, which was the beginning of the revolution in Syria, they have to film every day and compensate for the absence of foreign journalists through the videos that they post on YouTube.
You have become part of the story. You are the story right now. We're talking about you rather than about the civilians in Homs.
It wasn't the first time that I was covering the situation in Syria. I had gone there in December already. But there, the inability for me to move, the risks that I was incurring for my health, the risk of embolism, the risk of hemorrhaging, led to having to film this video to reassure my family, first of all, and to call on the authorities to do something, ask the ICRC to make sure that a convoy, that cars would be available to help us get out. Because at the outset, the verdict of the doctors was clear. I could not take the tunnel which connected Baba Amr and the rest of Syria. I could not leave through my own means from the neighborhood.
You tried to make an attempt. There was an initial attempt, as I understand, to try to get you to safety. That failed. It was eventually another attempt where they finally got you to the border. Did you resist leaving right away? We had heard reports that you didn't want to go unless everyone was able to leave, but you finally just felt you had to go with them.
I'm sorry to say that a lot of false things were said about us when we were in Syria. A lot of things. There were a lot of quotes without my knowing. I never said that those were the best days of my life. I never hoped to save all the Syrian children. That is what I was saying. I remain a journalist, and I'm not a militant, despite the situation. And if it had been possible to get in the vehicle of the Syrian Red Cross, I would have seized the opportunity, but this was not possible. And perhaps I could have been cared for earlier. Perhaps I could have had less sequelae, less trauma, and worried my parents less.
Do you think you could be still an objective journalist? You said you're not a militant, you're not advocating for a cause, you're a journalist. Do you think you've lost some of the ability to be objective about this crisis?
I hope not. And I don't think I'll be going back to Syria soon because it would be complicated with scratches.
That was a rhetorical question, we call it in English.
I'm afraid that the situation in Syria will not improve before I regain my mobility. The decision to go back and continue covering is difficult for me to take yet. It's difficult for me to imagine my professional future in the short term. I hope to continue to be objective. It is true that when we were in Syria, a lot of things were said, a lot of things were reported to us, a lot of information. It's up to William and myself to continue doing our job, continue saying, I need to go check this information. And the situation in Syria is such that you cannot check the information, or it is difficult to do so. That is the reason why a lot of false things were said about my state of health, my situation, what I was saying, what I was thinking. It was difficult to check the information in a country where there no longer is any communication and where the regime refuses to communicate objectively.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk about something that is still obviously very fresh in your mind and probably still very painful. And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.